Thank you for joining our webinar today. The topic we've got for you is assessing coastal risk in the Capital Regional District. My name is Jim Vanderwall. I'll be facilitating the webinar today along with Elena Chia, my colleague here. This webinar is part of our retooling series to strengthen capacity in climate adaptation. We've been doing 3 webinars this fall on various coastal climate change adaptation topics. And this is part of the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative, which FBC hosts to support local governments and First Nations and industry in preparing for climate change adaptation. You can also check out our website, which offers other materials, climate research guides, case studies, etc. And we will have a recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoints available there for you to check out. So during the webinar today, all of the audio of participants will be muted so that we can hear our speakers well. If you have any questions, as I mentioned earlier, please type them into the question box in your control panel. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment verbally, type something into the question box as well. And at the end of the presentation, we can selectively unmute your line so that you can ask your question. Any technical difficulties, send an email to fraserbasin@gmail.com. So today's presentation, we're fortunate to have a presentation by Nikki Elliott from the Climate Action Program at Capital Regional District, and she's going to be talking about assessing coastal risk in the Capital Regional District, which is an overview of their planning project, including 2 phases. The first looking at coastal sea level rise risk assessment, and the second phase, which identified a regional approach to sea level rise adaptation planning. And the project developed a toolkit of prioritized planning, regulatory, and site-specific adaptation tools. So at this point in time, we will turn things over to Nikki so that she can talk about her presentation, and just bear with us for a minute while we do that.
Great, thank you, Jim. Let's get this started here. Okay, so as Jim said, my name is Nikki Elliott. I coordinate the Climate Action Program here at the Capital Regional District. I'm going to talk about our sea level rise planning projects that we recently completed this summer. So for those of you that don't know, the Capital Region is an area around southern Vancouver Island. We're made up of 13 municipalities and 3 electoral areas. We do have 11 First Nations with reserve lands, of which 9 have settlements, and more than 22 First Nations identify the region as traditional territory. Our population stands at approximately 390,000. The CRD itself, so the Capital Regional District, we're a service provider basically to these 13 municipalities and 3 electoral areas. We provide over 200 services and we work with directly our stakeholders. Although we directly serve local governments, we often work with others such as residents, commercial institutions, industry entities, and other levels of government. So a little bit about the Climate Action Service and why we're involved in this project. We've been around since about 2009 to act as a hub and resource and facilitator for municipalities, citizens, and organizations in the Capital Region with a focus on energy climate issues, both mitigation and adaptation. We have 5 main areas of our program. One of the main ones is to support directly local governments in their climate action goals. So that's developing plans, implementing projects, and helping meet their commitments under Bill 27 and their voluntary commitments in the BC Climate Action Charter. We also have a role to increase public awareness on climate change issues and to help catalyze action. We liaise with senior levels of government on climate change related programs, policies, and legislation that impact our region. We also provide scientific information, data, and indicators related to local and regional greenhouse gas emissions and projected climate impacts, which definitely feeds into this project. And we also have a role in supporting the CRD itself in their climate goals. So to facilitate this, we host an intermunicipal, we have a couple groups, one with staff and reps and one with elected officials. And our staff group was very heavily involved in reviewing this project and helping to scope it. So today, I'm just going to have a brief overview of the project, talk about the two phases, like as Jim mentioned. One was a coastal sea level rise risk assessment. The other was an exercise to analyze planning approaches for sea level rise and to come up with a toolkit. I'll briefly touch on the provincial flood hazard area land use management guidelines because they did sort of impact the project, and talk about next steps. And we will have time for some questions at the end. So basically, there's two objectives of this project when we started. And one was to further understand the implications of sea level rise across the capital region. And then the other was to determine what responses are appropriate. So the phase one was really a technical exercise that mapped 24 focus areas that are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise for 3 target years: the year 2050, year 2100, and the year 2200. Assess the potential economic consequences for year 2100 scenario, and to do a couple of case studies about service disruption. The second phase, we did a literature review, we did a workshop, an education workshop, we did meetings with the CRD and municipal teams to discuss planning, and that ultimately fed into the development of a toolkit. I should mention, for those that aren't aware, about the authority for dealing with sea level rise planning. The province, local governments, and CRD, the region, regional government, all play different roles. So in a provincial context, in 2004, the province transferred responsibility for floodplain land use management to local governments. At that time, they put out a flood hazard area land use management guidelines to provide direction for local governments to implement land use management plans and make subdivision approval decisions for flood hazard areas. The province is currently amending this guideline to include considerations for sea level rise in coastal areas for the first time. The CRD does have actual local government authority for land use in our Juan de Fuca electoral area, but otherwise it's really up to local governments within the region, so those other 13 municipalities and the Islands Trust, to determine appropriate measures for dealing with sea level rise. The intent of this exercise was to assist them as they navigate that. So this project had a number of players in it. We received some funding from the Natural Resources Canada Adaptation platform in 2013. We also received some funding from Tides Canada, the City of Victoria, District of Saanich, and CRD put some funding as well. We also had a project team that were heavily involved in leading the project and scoping it. Reps from City of Victoria, the District of Saanich for the first phase, and then we expanded the team with reps from the town of Sydney, the District of North Saanich, and we did have a Ministry of Environment Climate Action Secretariat representative as well for both phases. Like I said, with this intermunicipal working group, they were involved in sort of an oversight committee, but the project team really led it. So now we'll talk about we'll dive deeper into this phase one of our project, the coastal sea level rise risk assessment. We scoped out this project in late 2013, and then it got finalized in January of 2015. So there's a number of tasks associated with this project. First was to do some inundation mapping of the entire CRD coastline, identify key assets, which fed in an exercise to define sea level rise focus areas, which we came out with 24 within the project scope that we were able to do. And within these focus areas, these 24 sites, we had maps produced. We had analysis on inundation depths at the different scenarios. We did land use analysis, shoreline characterization about erodible and sensitive shorelines. We did a little bit of an economic evaluation exercise, and like I said before, service disruption case studies for 3 sites. Now we'll go into detail about each step. The inputs into our mapping portion of the project were We had a number of them. So one was called the higher high water large tide. So basically that's an average of annual maximum high tide water levels from approximately 19 years of predicted tide data and represents the average annual high tide level. So we were able to obtain those levels and mean water levels from the Canadian Hydrographic Service network of tide gauge instruments. In our region, we have approximately 40 stations, and so data values were recorded relative to each station's local chart datum, which typically responds to the lowest recorded low tide value. Since each station's chart datum is different, it was necessary to convert all the water levels to a common vertical datum to facilitate consistent inundation mapping across the region. And so the consultants used a Canadian geodetic vertical datum of 1928. So once converted, these values for each station were mapped qualitatively across a mapping across the region. So within our study area, the values of higher high water large tide range from about 1.46 meters to 2 meters. And then to capture the spatial variability of the observed higher high water large tide, while also simplifying the mapping, the CRD study area was divided into 7 distinct hydrographic zones based on similar values. And you can see that on the figure shown on your screen right now, the different zones across the region. For the sea level rise scenarios, these were based on guidance from the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, the Coastal Floodplain Mapping Guidelines and Specifications. The following scenarios were developed for the inundation mapping in the CRD area, one being 0.5 meter increase for the 2050 scenario, a meter increase for year 2100, and a 2 meter for 2200. Now, for the storm surge scenarios, these were also determined by using the FLNRO Coastal Mapping Guidelines Specifications report. And so for highly developed areas, the report recommends that for British Columbia and Victoria, if we use a 1 in 500 year or 0.2% annual chance magnitude storm surge, so that equates to about 1.3 meters. This is also the work Sanko Stanwell Province of BC Ministry of Environment reports that many of you probably have heard of. Because of the scope of the project, we were only able to include one storm surge scenario, but for more rural areas, they do recommend 200-year storm surge. So for different zones, if we did further analysis, that could be changed. The next one that was included was the vertical uplift or subsidence. So again, these were presented in the Flint guidelines for each hydrographic zone. And these rates, they're relatively small input. It's a relatively small input compared to the for example, for one of the zones, I think it was about 5 centimeters in the year 2050 scenario, and it went up to 22 centimeters 2200 scenario. So all of this was overlaid on topographic and bathymetry data provided by the CRD and public sources. So the consultant AECOM, they developed a 1 meter resolution seamless topographic bathymetric digital elevation model. So this data set was used from a previous report the CRD had already done in 2013. They finished a study to model potential tsunami inundation limits and run-up. So we were able to use that to save some resources on our study. So basically this digital elevation model formed a single bare earth surface that extended from the open water up to the interior land surface elevation of an interior contour elevation about 10 meters from the chart datum, that 28 scenario. So in 2013, sort of after the project had, 2014, after the project had started, the CRD did obtain some LiDAR for a portion of the region. We still don't have it for the entire region. So within the scope of the project, we weren't able to use that for the mapping, but the consultants did do spot checks to check the elevation within the actual focus areas that were determined. There are 3 main guidance documents that were used for this study. I've mentioned a couple of them already. So the first was the BC Ministry of Environment's Climate Change Adaptation Guidelines for Sea Dikes and Coastal Flood Land Use by Sanko Stanwell stand well. So those that are familiar, this describes a combined method and probably arguably a more simplified methodology than others that you can choose for determining potential sea level rise inundation. I should note, and I'll get into a little bit further, but we did determine or decided, the project team decided not to include a wave effect and a freeboard criteria within the mapping. At the time, it was felt that for wave effects, a lot of the data to be useful to inform planning decisions, you need to do site-specific, just because the localized conditions feed so much into the wave effect analysis. That didn't fit within the scope of the study. We also decided to keep the freeboard criteria, which equates to about 0.6 meters. So that's basically a buffer zone. At this time, we decided to keep that out. So it'll be up to local governments to determine if they want to include that in their planning. Like I said, to determine the appropriate inundation water levels under the future sea level rise projections, methods were used from that Flynn Rowe coastal floodplain mapping guidelines and specifications report. And then once the relevant water level statistics were generated under the 6 inundation mapping scenarios, the maps were generated using methodologies developed by NOAA through their Coastal Services Center. The name of that report is that purple one there on the screen right now. So what we got from this portion of the project was detailed inundation mapping at the depth and extent of inundation, sea level rise planning areas for areas between the mean sea level rise and 2050 conditions, between 2050 and 2100 conditions, and between 2100 and 2200 conditions. We also got statistics about areas, the amount of area that would be inundated and average depth and all that. And so, right, like I said, inundated water surface mapping was done by extending the tidal water surface at the shoreline over the inland topography, and you can see an example on the screen there. I'll just go over one scenario or one site to give examples of what we got out of this mapping portion of the project. Like I said, there was 24 sites across the region, and we tried to get to determine these sites, we tried to get a diversity. They were chosen based on a list of criteria developed by the project team, which included regional representation, potentially highly impacted area, and a diversity of land use types. And there is at least one site within each municipality, except for 2, I believe, across the region. So the focus area, which I'm just going to show the example of, is a little settlement called Jordan River. It's just west of Vancouver. It's on the west coast of Vancouver Island, located approximately 70 kilometers west of Victoria. So this is within the Juan de Fuca electoral area, and it's an area that the CRD itself has land use authority over. So our first scenario was this higher high water large tide with 1.5 meters sea level rise. So this is the average high tide basically in a 2050 year scenario. And so as you can see, just with the light blue along sort of the inlet there's a little bit of inundation. The green is showing disconnected areas, so further analysis would need to be done to confirm that, but it's basically just showing the lowland areas. So the second scenario that was mapped for all 24 sites was the year 2100 year 1 meter sea level rise with the higher water large tide. The third one is the year 2200 year scenario with just sea level rise and average high tide. The fourth scenario, so we added in a storm surge to the scenario, so that's the year 2150 with a 1.3 meter storm surge. So again, that's a 1 in 500 year storm with average high tide. The fifth one, this is the year 2100 year scenario. I will flag that for all the further analysis, the land use and economic impact analysis, this is the scenario that it was built on. The average high tide plus 1 meter sea level rise plus a 1 in 500 year storm. And then the same area in the year 2200. next phase of the project was to identify coastal assets and uses within those sea level rise focus areas. And so of data, GIS data that the CRD mainly provided to the consultant was done to do this. We also held a workshop with CRD and municipal staff to identify key assets that may not necessarily be highlighted on data layers. And this was also to help sort of ID some of the costing for the analysis. Method, just was to identify land use within area and provide statistics, summary statistics within the report, and main public areas or public assets. We also included a basic characterization of the shorelines, and I'll get into that just a little bit further in the example. So for that Jordan River site, just pulled up some of the data we received for that. So for the actual land use, we used BC assessment data, which provides a record of actual uses for each parcel of land. There's over 200 categories in BC assessment data, and with each parcel of land being assigned one of these categories. So this was all spatially linked to the data layer that the consultants used and totaled and tabulated. And so this is sort of that first table is the result of what we got to see. For the zoning, each municipality and electoral area defines different zoning types within their areas, and so the total of area of land for each zoning type was calculated for each sea level rise focus area and provided and tabulated. Again, you can see that in that report. What's not shown here, but it is in the final report, is identification of First Nations reserves, and as well as road and rail, major pipeline and transmission lines, bridges, and key assets, like I said before. For the physical shoreline assessment, this was basically just pulled from a BC Park shoreline sensitivity model, sea level rise model that they have. So it was provided for the entire parts of the CRD coastline, as well as other parts of the province. And so the data set was used to calculate two measures. One was the shoreline type, and so the model provides a determination of which category of foreshore type best applies to each segment of the shoreline. And the model uses a series of categories based on substrate width and slope characteristics. For the sensitivity rating, which is sort of at the bottom of that table, the model provides an overall sensitivity to sea level rise rating for each segment of the shoreline, and this rating is based on separate sensitivity ratings derived for the foreshore. So this is based on substrate and width and slope and sediment mobility and exposure and backshore. And backshore criteria based on the slope and coastal habitat type. So with the most sensitive rating of the two being used for the overall sensitivity rating. And so no surprise that most areas, or all the areas that were mapped, did have a high sensitivity, or majority of the area of it had a high sensitivity to sea level rise. But as for the analysis for erodible shorelines, this is sort of where we all got at. Further study will be required. And so for the valuation of coastal assets, which is part of the economic risk assessment, we did use, again, that BC assessment parcel level data. And so it was summed all within that year 2100 plus 1 in 500 year storm surge inundation line for the sea level rise focus areas. The total market values of each of the categories that you saw on the list, so civic and institutional, commercial, farm, forestry, industrial, mining, petroleum industry, residential, transportation, community, and utility improvements. For the road and the rail, we came up with a little bit of methodology to capture those in the bridges and the key assets as well. So an example from that Jordan River case study is on the site here. So as you can see, split out by the different categories of land, the roads, with a little bit of methodology and identification of key assets, and where there was available, we could get valuation that was included in the report as well. So the valuation data used for this task represent the market values and should not be interpreted as a total financial cost or an economic impact of sea level rise in the focus areas. Actual property impact costs would be determined by the level of adaptation that takes place prior to the effects arising from sea level rise, the frequency and depth of inundation events that occur following sea level rise and impact the property, and of course the cost of recovery. All of these were not included in this study. Really the intent of this exercise was to get a broad indication of the values of land and improvements that may be at risk from the effects of sea level rise. And then the third sort of component, and probably one of the smaller ones, a little bit less effort went into this one, but the idea again was to get a broad understanding of what some of the service impacts, disruption impacts would be if there was an event with sea level rise in a storm surge scenario. And so the project team identified 3 high-level case studies they'd like to see more information on. And these were a transportation asset, a residential community, and a major business center. So within those focus areas that fit that criteria, one was picked for a little bit further analysis. Again, this scenario was based on the year 2100 500-year storm surge scenario. Just a quick summary of the results of this one. And so this is, again, the key economic costs of temporary service disruption caused by storm surge. And so these were expected to include foregone revenues of businesses that can't operate and are related to lost wages to employees, extra costs incurred from both providing alternative service provision where applicable and repairing damaged service delivery infrastructure, benefits to lost to users from not being able to use the service, and subsequent costs to users for utilizing alternative service options. So for each of the case studies, the consultant developed high-level estimates of the cost of these impacts to arrive at a total gross operational cost. Gross operational costs include all the above costs with the exception of repairing damaged infrastructure. So like I said, the results were you know, they're meant to provide a broad understanding of the potential impacts of disruption in present economic terms, and they did not project changes in transportation mode shifts, business revenue, or population, which really would ultimately define future economic impacts. Instead, the case studies adopted a model and a methodology that we could use in other focus areas if we so wished. So for this phase 1, I guess there was a few limitations. We definitely were limited by budget, and we have a very large coastline, and so we could only map 24 or do further analysis on 24 focus areas. We can definitely use the criteria and the methodology to do further mapping within our own internal capacity. So that's useful. We did use the simplified combined methodology. So that's adding all the criteria up to get sort of a very conservative number. Saying that, we didn't include wave effects and freeboard criteria, which we could be using in the future. This is a generalized estimate of inland that could be, or inundated water, and the study didn't take into account any effects associated with physics of overland flow, wave dissipation, levee overtopping, or potential shoreline erosion associated with any extreme events. We also, which was highlighted by some of the folks that we engaged the process, that it may be important to understand in the future inundation that could occur from flooding of drainage and other water systems, as this was not included. And then the tsunami work, although we use the same digital elevation model so that we can overlay some of that pretty easily, that wasn't included in this report. So moving on to our next phase project. This is our planning approaches project. I will say when we first scoped the project and went for funding from Natural Resources Canada, the intent of the second phase was to develop a model bylaw based on some of the information we had that municipalities, if they so choose, or electoral areas could adopt. That would be sort of a regulatory approach for affecting land use decisions across the capital region. So we did, as the project advanced, and which I'll talk about a little bit further at a different later, is the province released proposed amendments to the flood hazard area land use management guidelines, which provide dictates in it that how local governments could calculate potential flood construction levels, and so that just created more of a discussion amongst some of the players in the region. And we felt at the time of this phase 1 study being completed, the likelihood of municipalities or electoral areas ready to adopt a model bylaw wasn't there, and as well we wanted to wait to see what comes out of the proposed amendments from the province. So instead we shifted a little bit, recognizing there was still lots of work to do this exercise, this planning approaches project. So this really was to hit that second question, what responses are appropriate for the capital region. There's really 3 goals of the project. One was to educate and engage local governments and CRD staff on sea level rise implications and opportunities. 2, to identify and prioritize potential sea level rise adaptation approaches that are appropriate for the regions, municipalities, and electoral areas. And 3, support CRD and local governments in their planning efforts as they move forward. So the first step of the project, there were 3 areas that were reviewed in the literature review. One were different adaptation frameworks, the second was different decision-making tools, and finally the sea level rise adaptation measures themselves. And the measures ranging from planning tools to regulatory tools to site-specific adaptation. What we found is, there's general consensus amongst sea level rise literature, including, provincial provincial tools and guidance documents about the different frameworks or options to frame adaptation to sea level rise. And so we decided to hook onto this one as well and include it within our work. So that's the avoid, protect, accommodate, retreat ways to go about dealing with sea level rise. So avoid, not building assets in sea level rise or in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise at all. Protecting, so you continue occupation, but try to prevent the sea level rise impacts. Accommodate, you continue to occupy as well, while allowing some impacts of sea level rise. And retreat, planned withdrawal from areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. So really we tried to scope a lot of our discussions around these different options and using the phase 1 results to guide those conversations. The second criteria that we researched through this process was different decision-making tools. And what we really found was when trying to determine appropriate tools to assist CRD municipalities in electoral areas consider sea level rise approaches, that decisions aren't linear, and that one decision will inform another, and that they're often there's different players that need to influence that. There's science-based, meaning that study is required, and that there's an acknowledgement of uncertainty amongst decision makers, and that really is very complex when you're dealing with time frames and land use development infrastructure decisions over a 100-year plus time frame, with again the different folks that are responsible for dealing with it, from finance to engineers to planning to politicians. It's a really complex issue that we're dealing with. And then finally, with adaptation measures, tried to go over the multitude of planning and regulatory, site-specific, and overarching sort of education outreach that's required to inform some sort of adaptation plan. So we did try to involve the local governments within the region and CRD staff themselves as much as we can by providing project updates. We hosted a seminar. We brought in a couple of recs and academic rep, as well as a consultant, to go over the science of sea level rise. We did have a lot of questions about wave effect studies and if that was appropriate and when and how. So we talked about that, and then different kind of adaptation options that people could consider across the region. Then we led individual meetings with the CRD and municipalities. 9 of them took us up on that, so we had basically a cross-departmental discussion to go over the results of the phase 1, the legislative framework that's changing province or the guidelines that are coming down, and then do a vulnerability scan to help identify assets and land use types. Go through an exercise to rank their resilience, kind of using risk assessment frameworks. So ranking their resilience and sensitivity, any land use characteristics, timing considerations, and discussing social equity concerns. And then we also went over some adaptation tools and a little bit of exercise to identify what gaps and opportunities would be for sea level rise. Again, this is all to feed into our toolkit that would identify priority tools that municipalities could use for sea level rise planning moving forward. The draft sea level rise adaptation plan framework, like I said, was sort of these avoid, protect, accommodate, retreat, and we use this to kind of guide our discussion with municipalities and help to kind of within that sort of that third area where different assets would fit, and then have a little bit of an analysis for what's next after that. So is that you know, there's with the 13 municipalities, 3 electoral areas that all have different needs, different impacts of potential inundation of sea level rise, that to come to an agreement at this stage, we're just not there, even with the data that we know that education and outreach is really ultimately required from, you know, the homeowner level to staff internally to local governments, elected officials, that there's different sort of routes you can go and there's opportunities at different times. We've identified a couple for municipalities kind of to pursue right away, and then some for later term. So within the planning sort of column there, we found that some would really like or would pursue a sea level rise adaptation plan or an adaptation plan with sea level rise considerations, and part of that would be confirming the initial maps, adding different criteria if they wish or additional criteria, and setting sea level rise planning areas that could potentially inform regulatory responses. From a policy perspective, some municipalities could use an update, or when they're updating official community plans or local area plans, they could put a little bit more policy direction related to climate change adaptation and or sea level rise. Some already have that in there, and some could use to have that in there. And then there's opportunities within planning documents internally. So some municipalities are going through exercises within their utilities master plans or parks, their asset management acquisition plan. Sea level rise can definitely be included in criteria there, and using some of the data we have already. And again, studies. There's lots of, for some municipalities, need for studies, others not as much or at different times. So identifying when they would be appropriate. From the regulatory side, the flood construction bylaw, which speaks to the provincial guidelines, opportunity for municipalities if they so choose to go that route, and some of this information can inform that. Some like to see development using development permit areas, which set requirements and list appropriate adaptation tools within those areas. And we heard that municipalities are keen to prioritize use of green shores or non-structural soft armoring tools instead of, you know, your hard armoring. Using building permits, covenants, subdivision bylaws, and environmental easements are other ways that municipalities saw that could work for them. And of course, site-by-site initiatives by prioritizing different projects or areas or land use types that are at risk, doing some targeted engagement, using natural infrastructure, and doing detailed or site-specific adaptation plans that speak to a myriad of options, just not the building sort of infrastructure site or type issues. And so this is what our toolkit kind of comes down to, is within the document, they're sort of categorized within these areas and different actions that municipalities can choose if they so wish to move forward in one place, with links to examples of other jurisdictions, guidance documents that can help them out. So I'm just going to be very quick on this one. I'm running out of time here. So just the flood hazard area land use management guidelines. Like I said, the province is proposing to update these for building, subdivision, and zoning that allow for sea level rise to the year 2100. Like I said, local governments have regulatory authority, but really they must consider if they have a bylaw, a flood hazard bylaw or land use bylaw, they have to consider these guidelines. There's two methods for establishing the year 2100 flood construction level. One is using probabilistic analysis, and the other is the combined method. So the combined method is the one that we use for the study minus wave effects and freeboard. So flood construction level is one of the main regulatory tools that was identified within the kit to adapt to sea level rise, but it is each local government's responsibility to analyze, interpret, and apply the guideline as they wish, and potentially update their mapping if they so wish. And it sounds like, you know, there may be some municipalities that are keen to do this. Next steps for us is just really to support within the climate action service of the CRD, stay on top of provincial guidelines, support regional future sea level rise planning efforts. If we're going to do more local or regional study, programming and policies, and we're actually going to be participating in a Green Shores education and training project that they're developing curriculum and doing some workshops across coastal communities the next few months, and so we're assisting with that as well. So that's it for me. We do have our two reports are public, and you can find them on that website, very long website there. But everything's there, minus some maps, just because they were too large to put up on the website. But if you have any questions, feel free. You can ask them now, but also there's my contact information too. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Nikki. That's a very comprehensive presentation on obviously a lot of work that's been done in the capital region on this topic, and still more to come. I can see that people are already typing into the question box, so feel free to do that, and we'll go through them. And if you would like to ask your question, we can, as I said before, unmute you, but just let us know in the question box if you would want to do that. Before we go to the questions, we're just going to do a very quick poll to see who's on the webinar with us today. So us know the type of organization that you're with by clicking on the poll, and then we'll show you the results. All right, great. So we see you've got a really great mix of folks here from local government, provincial, business or consulting, as well as a few academics and non-government organizations. So that's great. First question here, which came in, was were there any public or was public participation thought out in the project?
That's definitely next phase. So within that, the phase 2, we had discussions with when are we comfortable. So the information is released publicly, and it has been through the board, but there hasn't been any engagement to talk about it. So we do understand that we need to sort of understand the impacts first before, or the opportunities for the impacts before we could thoroughly do any public engagement. But 2, we determined if this will be at municipal scale, if they would like to do their own, or regional scale. So still working, so that's part of the role, to work with that intermunicipal working group to identify appropriate approaches.
Great. The next question is from Tim Pritchard. His question is, did the study do any correlation with data from Washington State?
No, it didn't. It was all basically following those provisions and which use the provincial data or the regional local data. So no, that was not part of the scope.
Okay. And a question from, was the present value used for the land valuation, or was there some consideration of changes in land value in the future scenario?
Yeah, it was just present value. That's all that we could get in within our scope. So again, future opportunity.
Okay. Now, I have a question on that myself. Is maybe I missed it in the presentation. Did you sum up the value of all the land that's potentially at risk?
We did. And to tell you the truth, I don't have it off the top of my head. I do know that they ranged from, one site was 300 million, I believe, to I think 4 million or 2 million. But I would have to get back to you on that one. It's somewhere here.
Even if an overall number, that might be helpful.
Yeah, should have pulled that. Sorry.
The results of your study, obviously, that doesn't say that is the impact, but I think helping people understand the significance of what's at risk is an
Right,
important.
and to be fair, it's not because it's only 24 focus areas, it's not really indicative of the entire region for that economic value. So it really is more about the focus area, the cost within that focus area that's the most useful at this time.
Okay. I'm just going to be fair to everyone, I'm just going to skip to the next person who's asked a question. I'll come back. I see, Tim, you've asked a few questions here. So we'll come back to your questions after others have had a chance. Well, sorry, Christina Calahoo just made a comment. It's a great overview, and she's looking forward to reviewing the webinar in detail and the results. Question from Andrew Gage. BC government consultant report says the lower mainland municipalities will need to spend $9.5 billion between now and 2100 to address rising sea levels. Do you have any sense of what reasonable adaptation measures would cost the CRD, or any plans to quantify that figure?
I don't have a sense of that, to tell you the truth, right now, but there is plans in the future working with municipalities to identify that, which could help sort of feed into the business case for action.
Great. A question from Sean Smith is, who provided the conversion of tide gauge data from local chart datum to a common geodatic vertical datum, and were there challenges in doing this?
It was the consultant, so AECOM. They did that as part of their work in the report, and you'll have to, I would suggest going to that section in the report. You can find it online to see exactly how they did that. And I can't speak to if they had issues, to tell you the truth.
Okay, something to ask them about, I guess, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
A question from Steve Litke is, did any of the adaptation options seem to be best suited as transitional strategies as we change policies and practices over time to keep pace with moving flood hazards?
Yes, definitely. That's part of the discussion of is phasing appropriate, or what are you allowed to do to a certain year? What kind of infrastructure, what type, or land use type? Nothing has been determined, to my knowledge, or nothing's written in stone right now. But that's definitely part of the conversation and the complexity of this issue of requiring something right now. For uncertain data and all that stuff, and so we just have to start making decisions. But it's part of the complexity. Just part of the complexity of us trying to determine appropriate approaches. But it's one of those things that comes up in most conversations when you're talking with folks about how to move this forward.
Okay, Bruce Gregg had a question here. Has further mapping work been considered to include and a consistent freeboard factor across the region? And any thought on what municipal participation would entail? A common methodology and shared costs seem like a wise approach.
Right, and that's been part of the conversation with the intermunicipal groups and at the board level, but nothing in detail at this time. From what I've heard, we're not prepared to advance anything further. There isn't agreement among all the players about further mapping, and so I think it's a little bit, people, as I understand it, what I'm hearing from some of our stakeholders, they're trying to still understand what the implications are and what the needs are for them. So as I understand it, for wave effects, there's different levels of methodology which have different cost implications, and some, it might make sense for a big development to do something more intensive and costly, as opposed to a more rural area to pick sort of a different number. But I do know different municipalities some are navigating it. They're advancing the conversation earlier than others, and I'm happy to discuss with Bruce if he wishes.
Great. Another question from Tim Pritchard is, here's a hot topic, is having responsibility shifted to individual local municipalities an effective or efficient way of addressing sea level rise issues within the province?
Good question. I think I can say it's a challenge to deal with, and just recognizing the resources. And we have, I'm speaking for, I can't even speak for I can speak for myself. The resources I have to deal with this issue and looking for where people are looking for support, it's a tough one and it's a complex issue. And so we are heavily reliant on provincial guidelines and guidance documents to help us sort that out. But definitely, when you're looking at the resourcing, even to do further study or implement action, it's a whole other beast. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think local governments are going to struggle with that one.
Okay, yeah, so, and I think you answered Tim's following question, which is, yeah, that municipalities don't have sufficient resources. One other question here, I guess also from Tim, is should a sea level rise action plan be by municipality or be island-wide?
Yeah, I think for how the legislation falls, it needs to be by municipality. We'll do our best to make sure they're not conflicting, and it's nice we have a service and we have the regional district to help advance that. But within the local government authority, it's really up to municipalities to enact, recognizing that our borders are close and we have infrastructure that overlay. So lots of conversations have to happen. But as it stands, yeah, it's within local government authority.
Okay. We do have time for a couple more questions if anybody wants to type something in, or if you want to let us know in the question box and we can also unmute you. Well, since we don't have any questions, we have one more poll for you just to get your input on our future work. So if we'll do this to provide some input to us on what topics you're interested in learning about in terms of future sessions. So feel free to fill that out. Okay, well, we'll have a look here and see. Well, obviously, there's a lot of interest in coastal management, not surprisingly given our topic today. But looks like the next top issue is around infrastructure, stormwater transportation, etc., as well as emergency preparedness. So something that will be helpful for us in our future planning here. Well, I would like to take the chance now to thank Nikki for her presentation and for answering the questions that everyone's raised, and thank all of you for your participation and also for all the great questions. We find that we get a lot of good discussion after these webinars. I also wanted to mention that we do have a following webinar in our series on Wednesday, December the 2nd, same time, 11 a.m., on planning for a resilient waterfront at Qualicum Beach. So they've also been doing some interesting work there. So please join us for that, and you'll be getting an email reminder about that. Finally, I just wanted to thank Natural Resources Canada for their financial support for this work through the Adaptation platform, as well as the support of the BC Climate Action Secretariat, who helps us in coordinating the BC Inundation Collaborative. So thanks everyone again for participating, and we look forward to having you involved in our future activities.